I'm getting, I guess, a little famous lately for doing a little sidestep before we get into our text. I figure we can always go back to the history that's in Acts. But I've been doing some thinking about Paul lately, and I wanted to interject something. I know that William is on the Wednesday morning class. You're still dealing with Paul, right? Yeah. But I want to point out something. If you'll turn in your Bibles to 2 Corinthians and chapter 11, and we're going to look at verse 23 through 28. 2 Corinthians 11, 23 through 28. Are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool. I am more, in labors more abundant, in stripes above measure, in prisons more frequent, in deaths oft. Of the Jews 5 times received I 40 stripes, save one. Thrice was I beaten with rods. Once was I stoned. Thrice I suffered shipwreck. A night and a day I have been in the deep. In journeyings often, in perils of waters, in perils of robbers, in perils by mine own countrymen, in perils by the heathen, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren, in weariness and painfulness, in watchings often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness. Beside those things that are without, that which cometh upon me daily, the care of all the churches. When we look at that list, you can't help but wonder, how in the world could someone go through all of that? When you look at the scriptures, we see that a woman was considered an elder woman, and to allow the church to take care of her or put her to work, she had to be 60 years old. So let's say that at maybe the time that this was written, or well, not at the time this was written, but at the time Timothy and Titus were written, he was in advanced age. Being a member of probably the guard of the Sanhedrin, one of the officers of the Sanhedrin, he would probably have been somewhere around 30 years old when he was converted to Christ. So if we look at his age and we say, well, 30 years, let's just say for argument's sake, for 30 years, all of these things were done to him, and probably more that we don't even know about, because we have some in this list that there's no recorded instance of except in this list. In other words, he didn't give us the details as he was going through the book of Acts, some of these things that were done, or in any of the other books. But it's mentioned, several of them are mentioned here. He shipwrecked 3 times. Well, we know of once. That's recorded for us in Acts. Beaten with rods 3 times. Well, again, 1 time is recorded for us, and details are given in the book of Acts. But in 30 years, all of these things were done to him. Now, I have a question for you. Who did these things to Paul? Was it the Jews? They did some of them, didn't they? Now, y'all can nod your heads one way or the other. I promise they won't fall off. Did the Jews do these things? Some of them did. Yeah, 5 times he received 40 stripes, save one. Mentions them there. So we have the Jews. What about Gentiles?
3 times I was beaten with rods. That would be Gentiles.
That would be Gentiles.
Jews wouldn't have done that.
Exactly. The Jews did not punish someone with rods, beating them. They beat them with what we would call a cat o' nine tails. That's long strands of leather many of them put together, or at least a number of them put together with pieces of stone or broken glass or pottery or things tied into it. In other words, to afflict a lot of damage.
Once
Cutting
on stone, that was the Jews in Lystra
Yeah.
did that.
So, and when you look at what the Jews did to him, many times what the Jews did to him, they did through the instrumentality of the Gentiles, didn't they? Now, I'm heading towards something here. Open your Bibles now to Titus chapter 3 and verse 1. Titus 3 and verse 1. I've been studying the book of Titus in particular and trying to write the best I can a commentary on Titus. And the last few days I've been looking at verse 1 of this text. Put them in mind to be subject to principalities and powers, to obey magistrates, to be ready to every good work. I'm going to read it now a little differently, and you will have to imagine parentheses around some of these words, but more of an explanation. Put them in mind, remembrance, to be subject, obedient to principalities, first in order, rulership, and powers, authorities, to obey magistrates, ruler or superior would be probably the better term, to be ready, prepared, to every good, excelling and distinguished work. Now, if you allow me to give you Bob's translation based on looking at the original words here and what I've shown you a little bit about what they say, it would be this way. Put them in remembrance to be obedient to those first in order, rulership, and authorities, to obey superiors, to be prepared to every excelling and distinguished work. Now, the way we started tonight, we showed the beatings, the mistreatment, terrible mistreatment, both by religious governments and secular governments. The Jews' religious government, run by the Sanhedrin, the secular governments, Roman authorities, etc. So when you look at it, we need to remember something about this. And I'm not getting into all of the details of what I've been writing and thinking about, but we need to remember as Christians that we carry dual citizenship. When you look at some people from various nations, for instance, we have a future daughter-in-law who is French, and she is working toward getting her citizenship in the United States. And when she gets that, she will be a dual citizen of both France and the United States. And there are a lot of people in the world who have dual citizenship in different countries. But as a Christian, you and I need to remember that we have dual citizenship that carries responsibilities with that citizenship, or those citizenships. We have our heavenly citizenship, which is in the Lord. And we have our secular citizenship, which is an American citizen, a citizen of the United States. And we have to be willing to submit to the authority of both of those citizenships. Now, I want that to sink in. We have to be willing to submit to the authority of both of those citizenships. Number one, God. He has to be first in our lives, but also we have to submit to that secular authority. I want you to notice the relativity to secular citizenship. Paul did not, nor did Jesus, nor did God in any form or the Spirit ever distinguish regarding the kind of government one is subject to in this life. Now, I'm not talking about the religious now. I'm talking about secular authority, secular government. There's no distinction between, well, you've got to submit if it's a good government, and you don't have to submit if there's an evil. It just says you submit, period. It doesn't say, now, if it's a generous government, for instance, if you look at Singapore, Singapore is a dictatorship. But it is a benevolent dictatorship. They treat their people right. They don't just run roughshod over them like most dictatorships do. God didn't say, you submit if it's a generous government that you live under, or you don't submit if it's oppressive. Notice the text in Titus 3. Be subject to principalities and powers. What does that deal with? Does it deal just with our conduct? No. Context easily shows us it also deals with our attitudes, just as in chapter 2, the regulations that were given to slaves. It wasn't eye service that's supposed to be given. We're not supposed to give eye service to the federal government. There are no exceptions. God didn't make any exceptions. You just submit. And He covers it all, from whoever is the head, to who's in between, to even local authorities. Those three designations that are given there. Consider with me for a moment, if you will, Matthew chapter 22. In verse 15 through 21, you'll remember in that context, some of the Jews were testing or tempting Jesus. They're trying to get Him in trouble. They're trying to get Him to say something that will get Him in trouble with one party or another. It doesn't matter to them who it is if they can just get Him in trouble with one of them. And you remember the question they asked. They came to Him and they said, now, and I'm going to paraphrase, they said, now, you know, Lord, they started out by saying, flattering Him, you know, we know that you don't care for anybody's person. That is, you don't care whether they're rich or poor. You don't care what nation they're from. You don't care what color they are. You treat everybody the same. Isn't that basically what He said? So they asked their question. Is it right? Is it lawful for us to render the poll tax, the tribute, to Caesar? Now, remember, they thought they had Him. No matter how He answers this question, oh, we got Him. If He says, no, it's not, oh, then the Roman government's going to come down on His shoulder for treason. If He said, yes, the Jews, hating the image that was on the coin or the tax money, would despise Him, and now He's in trouble with them. So either way, they thought they had Him. Well, you know, Jesus answered that in a way that showed it. Look, you know, I've often thought Jesus could have easily said, why are you trying to trick me? Haven't you learned yet that you can't put me on the horns of a dilemma? You can't get me to say something that is wrong. I'm only going to speak the truth. Well, We know what took place. Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's. The illustration, the coin. Whose image is on that coin? Oh, it's Caesar's. Well, in other words, that coin belongs to Caesar. So you render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and you render to God what belongs to God. Remember, the Jews had a special coin that could be contributed into the temple, the treasury of the temple. It didn't have any images on it of people. To them, that was blasphemous. And remember, Jesus lived in the time of the Old Testament law. Jesus, notice, didn't say anything about the fairness of this taxation law, did he? He didn't say anything about whether or not that tax money would be used for good or for evil. Our government, all secular governments, do something that is wrong, do they not? Don't they use our tax money for both good things and evil things? He didn't say whether the tax code was fair or not, depending on if you're rich and have all these tax deductions and et cetera, et cetera. Didn't say anything about that. He knew, did he not, that Caesar claimed to be a god, and thus the image on the coin of Caesar, in a very real sense, was blasphemous in that sense. Without restriction, Jesus said, obey this odious law. Pay the tax. That could be considered a euphemism for all of the tax laws, all of the laws of the Roman government. He was not against paying or following the law. In fact, Jesus himself paid the tax, did he not, in Matthew chapter 17? Human society has to be regulated by government. A society without laws devolves into nothing but chaos and anarchy. Further, when we look at passages like Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 7, we see that we're to pray for our secular leaders. You mean even that old fellow Nero, who started out good, believe it or not, as far as secular governments are concerned, not good in the eyes of God, and then turned extremely evil. You mean I'm supposed to pray for him? Oh, Paul lived in that time, didn't he? God has ordained secular government. That's why we're supposed to pray for them. That's why we're supposed to submit to them. Because you see, to violate the laws of the government is the exact same thing as violating God's law. It's the exact same thing of being in rebellion to Him if we're in rebellion to the secular government under which we live. If not, why not? Romans 13:7 or 1 through 7 tells us that. That means that as a Christian, I am going to try and beautify my God, my Lord, the Spirit, and His Word. How? By not being a rebellious person who is constantly stirring up problems for the society in which I live. Now, there is an exception to that rule of obeying our government. We don't have to obey the government no matter what it says, but I would suggest people better be careful when they think about that. Oh, we know what happened in Acts chapter 4. The apostles were commanded by the Jewish government, the Sanhedrin, don't you talk about Jesus anymore. Don't you speak in His name. Don't you speak by His authority. Don't you teach about Jesus. What did they do? They went right out, went right back to the places where they'd been teaching and continued to publicly teach about Jesus. Oh, and the reasons given. Whether it's right in your eyes or not, the Sanhedrin's, to obey you rather than God, you be the judge. Again, I'm paraphrasing. Their actions showed, being inspired men, that God expected them to disobey any government law that would cause us to sin. Now, here's where the caution comes in. A lot of folks say, well, you know, I think that maybe I can be justified in rebelling against the government, talking nasty about my rulers, and that's verse 2 of Titus 3. I can talk nasty about them, I can denigrate them, and I can just, give them down the road, just badmouth them. Can't do it. Not according to Titus 3, 1 and 2. And when I do, am I not in essence stirring up, or if I do that, am I not in essence stirring up rebellion against that government? Now, understand something. I don't have to like the form of government that I'm under. If I lived in China and was subject to their laws, that means I got to follow whatever the Chinese government says, as long, again, as it does not violate God's law. And I may not like being under that kind of a government, and I don't think I would, and I don't think you would either. But I have to show the respect for their laws and obey their laws as long as they do not violate God's law. That's all of their laws, whether I tend to agree with them or disagree with them. Now, how would you classify that today? Well, we're getting close to tax season, right? If you're like me, I've already sent my taxes to my account. I want them out of there. I don't want anything to do with them. I don't want to see them again until they take care of it and tell me whether I owe money or get some back. Do you? When you send them in? I don't agree with the tax laws, but I'm not going to fight against them. I'm not going to try to destroy those tax laws by rebellion. Well, what about something as simple as turning your turn signal on 285 South? Did you know that a police officer can give you a ticket for not turning? Oh, you may be speeding. You may be going 90 miles an hour down that road. But he can give you a ticket for not turning your turn signal on when you switch lanes. You know how I know that? No, Jenny got one. She got a ticket, or a warning ticket for doing that. And she was speeding. She was going along with the flow of the traffic. When the blue lights came on, she looked at her speedometer. Oh, wait a minute. What about speeding? Does that law violate, any speed law violate? In Trenton, Tennessee, when I was I was grown. I was back out of the military, out of Vietnam, and it was still there then. There was a speed limit sign that said 22 miles per hour. 22. And when I asked Dad, why is that speed limit 22? Why isn't it like 20 or 25 or, like normal speed limit signs? He said, years ago, people would go before the judge when they got a speeding ticket on that road, and they'd say, but Judge, I was just going 22 miles an hour. So guess what the judge did finally? He got tired of it. And he had a speed limit sign made for that road, 22 miles an hour. Now, some, at least one in this audience, doesn't like to go the speed limit. But as a Christian, I'm obligated to try to the best of my ability to go to the speed limit, aren't I? And it is my obligation as a Christian to obey every law to the best of my ability that our secular government lays down before us. And if I decide that I don't like that law, I'm not going to obey that law, I'm not going to try to obey that law, then I'm in rebellion to the federal government, but I'm also in rebellion, Romans 13, to the law of God, because He ordained these officials, and the context shows clearly, so that there will be law and order. And for the purpose of our obeying and showing everybody else how to be obedient to law, we obey that law, we show them the God we serve. And notice that last phrase in verse 1, be ready to every good work. The word ready there's an interesting word from the original. And what it basically shows us is that Christians are to be consistently aggressive in goodness. And it's to be done not simply out of duty, but because of our love for our Lord and our fellow man. Is obeying the government a good work? Is helping our neighbor when they have trouble a good work? Yeah. A lot of good works out there. And our government even does some good works, and we need to support those good works. Alrighty, I've sidestepped. Now let's go back to Acts chapter 17. I'm going to go ahead because it was 2 weeks because of sickness and stuff, and read verses 1 through 4, and then we'll get to and in verse 4 we'll pick up with our thoughts. Now when they had passed through, that's Paul and his company, through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where was a synagogue of the Jews. I want to notice an implication there. In the cities of Amphipolis and Apollonia, notice it says they passed through. I would suggest that that probably indicates, considering the rest of the verse, that there was no synagogue in those two cities. Because when they get to Thessalonica, immediately it's mentioned there is a synagogue. And Paul, as his manner was, went in unto them, and 3 Sabbath days reasoned with them out of the Scriptures, opening and alleging that Christ must needs have suffered and risen again from the dead, and that this Jesus whom I preach unto you is Christ. And some of them believed and consorted with Paul and Silas and the devout Jews, and of the devout Greeks, a great multitude, and of the chief women not a few. Now, excuse me. It says some of them believe. That is, that's another word that frequently is used in the Scriptures, not always, to mean that they became Christians. Well, we ask the question, who became Christians? Where did Paul go to teach? In the synagogue. Who was generally in the synagogue? Jews. Now he's going to get to the Gentiles, but right here he's dealing with the Jews. And it's notice, what did these Jewish Christians do? Or at least some of them. Some of them consorted, as King James says, proskleroo. And what that means is associated with. So when it says that they consorted with Paul and Silas, they associated with them. That indicates, again, that these were people who became Christians, and now they want to associate with Paul and Silas, and they're interested in learning the truth, in being their companions, in being fellow servants, or Silas, I should say. Excuse me. Notice some difference here. Some Jews were converted. Did you notice that? But a great multitude of devout Gentiles were converted. Look at the difference. Some of the Jews in the synagogue were converted, became believers. But there's also another class of people that are mentioned, and they're Gentiles. They're devout Gentiles. Many have thought that this means that they were those who had become proselytes to Judaism. But consider what Paul said about them in the Thessalonian letter. He said, ye turn to God from idols. If they were proselyte Jews that's being spoken about, they would not have been worshiping idols. But when Paul talks about the time when he was there and when they were converted, he said, ye turn to God from idols to serve the living and true God. 1 Thessalonians 1 and verse 9. Also, notice, many, not a few, high-ranking women were converted out of their society. Women who held positions of honor, women who held positions of authority and power. Yes, there were many women in that time, even though we're told by those who try to eschew history that, no, they were just treated worse than dirt back then. Now, some of them were. In fact, many of them may have been. But in the Greek society in which they lived, and in the Roman society, they could rise to positions of great power and authority. And some of them did. Notice that 4 groups are basically seen here. You have the Jews of the synagogue. You have the Gentiles who were classed as God-fearers, not yet proselytes, but God-fearers. Gentiles, pagans and idol worshipers, and honorable women, socially prominent women. Now, why would more Gentiles respond to the gospel than Jews? Wouldn't you normally think, well, maybe that'd be the opposite way around? Well, look at the times of Jesus. Most of the Jews rejected him. we might tend to think or be tempted to think that these Jews, they served the one God. They believed in a coming Messiah, and when they were told about this Messiah, they would jump at the opportunity to obey Him, to be part of His number, part of His family, part of His army, if you please. But that isn't the way it looks. A few of them did. Some did. So why would the Gentiles be more apt to respond to the gospel than the Jews? May I offer this suggestion? I'm going to offer it whether you want me to or not. They weren't hung up on the false expectations that the Jews were. Remember, the Jews weren't looking for a Messiah like He turned out to be. They were looking for a Messiah who was literally going to put a crown, a physical crown on His head, hold a scepter in His hand, lead His armies, and defeat all the Gentiles, especially those old hated Romans. The Gentiles didn't have that expectation. And a lot of the Jews, simply because Jesus wasn't what they expected, they refused to accept Him, refused to follow Him. You remember on one occasion, Jesus had been teaching the people and He fed thousands of people, all at one time, miraculously. Well, you see, they thought, here's the Messiah. And they tried to force Him to be a king. Remember that? They tried to force Him to be a king. He said, Why? For the same reason that He told Pilate, my kingdom's not of this world. I'm not here to set up a physical kingdom, a secular kingdom. I'm here to set up a different kind of kingdom. Is it possible that the Gentiles, because of the world they lived in, and we've talked about this in the past, how it was so cruel and so filled with no hope, that they were more willing to accept the idea that they needed somebody to die for them? Look at verse 5. But the Jews which believed not, moved with envy, took unto them certain lewd fellows of the baser sort, and gathered a company, and set all the city on an uproar, and assaulted the house of Jason, and sought to bring them out to the people. The Jews which believed not, what'd they do? They were moved with envy, which caused them to react. There would have been unbelieving Jews in every synagogue of that time. But here were some that, remember, some had obeyed, some believed, but those who didn't believe were moved with envy. Dazlo'o, to have warmth of feeling for or against. You see, the word itself in the original doesn't indicate whether it's for or against, but the context here shows us that this envy caused them to move against with warmth or heat. In other words, anger. They're angry. They're going to move against Paul and Silas. Thayer defined this word as to burn with zeal. Again, zeal can be good, but zeal can also be bad. Here again, in the context, it is evil. When we go through the Scriptures, have you ever looked at the word envy and looked at it from the perspective of what will envy cause? What kind of things has envy done in the past? Well, the Bible gives us some illustrations of it, doesn't it? For instance, in Acts chapter 7, we're told that the patriarchs, they sold Joseph into bondage. Why? because of envy. They envied the position that he had with his father. They envied him. They were caused to react with zeal against him because of the dreams that he had that showed he was going to be superior to them. And it all came to pass. In Mark chapter 15, the Jewish leaders, notice, delivered Jesus to Pilate. Why? The text says, because of envy. They envied Jesus. They hated him, yes, because of who he claimed to be. But also that envy would have been caused because they could see that exactly what the Scriptures say about Jesus was true. What did he do? He went about doing good, not evil, never anything questionable by God's law. When we look at Acts chapter 5, we see that the high priests and the Sadducees locked the apostles up. Why? The text says, for envy. When we look at the Jews of Antioch, why did they blaspheme, speak against the words that Paul spoke from God? Again, the text says envy. Paul said that those who didn't like to retain the knowledge of God were full of envy. Romans 1. Paul said that those who do not consent to wholesome or healthy doctrine are full of envy. 1 Timothy 6:4. You see what envy will cause people to do with regard to religion? It will cause them to ignore what God says. It will cause them to persecute those who are trying their best to obey God. It will cause them to speak against God, to speak against His Word. To do one is to do the other. And they'll look at doctrine and say, no, no, no. Envy is almost always destructive, not constructive. I said that wrong, didn't I? Envy is almost always destructive, not constructive. Well, what did they do because of their envy? They took unto themselves certain lewd fellows of the baser sort. Lewd fellows. Let's talk about that. Today, I'll give you an illustration. Webster defines the word lewd. It's not used the way it was in our text or in the time when the King James was translated. Webster defines the word lewd for us as crude and offensive in a sexual way. Or I should say Google says that. Webster said it's obscene, vulgar, sexually unchaste, or licentious. And that's how the word lewd is primarily used in our society today. But the Greek word here, panairos, means hurtful. That is, evil condition. They were people who were evil in the way they lived and their condition of life. And it's talking about a physical sense, diseased or blind. In an ethical sense, evil, wicked, bad. So they took to themselves certain evil men. They took to themselves certain wicked men, certain bad men. And another classification is then given of a baser sort. And by the way, before I move off of that, the word fellows there is the Greek word aner, which specifically deals with a male only. There's a different word for both male and female, or either or. And there's a specific word for female. The word used here for fellows is the word aner. They found them a group of men who were base, mean, ugly, evil people. In other words, what they did is they went looking for troublemakers. They went looking for people who were known to be troublemakers. And they're called a baser sort. Agoraios. Frequenting the marketplace. Now, when we think of somebody that's a baser sort, we think of somebody that's always doing bad things, don't we? They're just evil. But this word is talking about those who frequented the marketplace. But a certain kind of person, an idler. A person who just didn't seem to have anything to do, just loaf around and idle and low life and just, live off of everybody else. Mean and vulgar. What did they do with these lewd and baser sort? Well, they gathered them into a company. In other words, a group. Gathered them into a crowd, a mob. We've seen a lot of that in the United States in the last few years, haven't we? People get upset about something, they start gathering a bunch of people, and they somehow get them all agitated and excited, and next thing you know, you got a mob, and most of the people in the mob have no idea why they're even in the mob. They're just caught up in the excitement, caught up in the evil that's being done by the mob. Well, what did these Jews want from this mob? What did they want? They wanted to set the city in an uproar. They wanted them to get so agitated that people would join them and do whatever it is that they're going to be doing. Thorobeo, to disturb. That's what it means, uproar. To disturb, to throw into confusion. What happens when a mob gets created? There's a lot of confusion. A lot of people have no idea why they're doing this. They're just caught up in it. To cause to be troubled in mind. Oh, and watch what that then leads to. Wailing or tumultuous behavior. Well, when they went to get Paul, they couldn't find him. So what did they do? They went to Jason's house and they assaulted the house and sought to bring Jason and those who were in the house out to the mob. I want you to notice something here. I've heard people over the years say, let the elders and the preacher take care of any problems that come along. Anybody that tries to teach false doctrine or anybody who tries to do wrong to the church, let them take care of it, and we'll just stay in the background and we won't be bothered by this. Did you notice the word them? Assaulted the house of Jason and sought to bring them out to the people. Was it Jason who was teaching the things that they didn't want to hear and wanted to cause a riot about? No. It wasn't the leaders, Paul and Silas. They're going to bring them out. Now, what's the importance of that? When persecution comes against the church, when ugly things are said about the church, it's not just being said about who the leaders in the congregation are. It's against all of us. And we need to make sure we understand that. It's against all of us. We can't hide. We've got to stand and back our congregational leaders in that which is right against those which are evil. Well, my time is passed up. But we got to the next section we're going to look at next week, verse 6 and 7.